In 1836, Appalachia, USA, midwife Eleanor Wade emerged from a cabin with her apron drenched in blood, cradling not an infant, but a bundle of stained linens that concealed something unrecognizable, a sight that silenced the gathered neighbors. Her stern face, framed by streaks of white in otherwise raven-dark hair, betrayed no trace of horror, only exhaustion, while the mother inside writhed in muffled agony. Wade's hands, strong and deliberate, moved with an unsettling calm, as though this grotesque outcome were routine. Known among the Cherokee as the Mother of Shadows, her presence carried weight in a region already fractured by forced removals, failing harvests, and the constant echo of gunfire from distant militias. In a sworn ledger kept by the town clerk, her name appears 13 times within 5 years, each beside a stillbirth or aberrant delivery. What precisely was Eleanor Wade concealing from both her community and the law? Respected as a healer and guardian of fragile lives, Eleanor Wade carried herself with quiet authority, her measured steps often accompanied by the sharp scent of crushed herbs clinging to her clothes. Yet a court transcript from 1839 records that 3 women described identical mutilations at birth, a pattern too precise to ignore, demanding the story begin. Você diz, now continue with Chapter 1, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script the beginning of the escalation, where you will report the first concrete signs that something is wrong, introduce witnesses, neighbors, or official records that mention unusual changes. Describe scenes with sensory depth, e.g. creaking doors, dust in the air, etc. Reinforce the atmosphere of strangeness and apprehension. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words such as unbelievable, attention, etc. Allowed examples: unbelievable, attention, okay. Do not use forbidden characters, tinit. Bisios lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 1, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingalls Longer Horror. Dice. The winter of 1836 in the Appalachian foothills carried with it more than the bitterness of cold air. It brought silence that pressed against the walls of cabins, a silence broken only by the restless crack of timber in the hearth or the distant howl of a lone animal across the ridges. In a clearing near the edge of Cherokee land stood the modest cabin of Eleanor Wade, a woman who had entered countless homes in the region to deliver children into the world. She was spoken of with respect, yet also with unease. Those who looked closely often noticed how she lingered too long over her instruments after each delivery, polishing them until the smell of iron filled the room, or how her gaze rested not on the child, but on the mother, as if measuring something. Unseen. The first whispers came in January, when Martha Dobson, a farmer's wife of 22, went into labor during a snowstorm. Neighbors who gathered to assist recalled the eerie calm with which Wade arrived. Her boots left trails of packed snow that melted into muddy pools across the floorboards, and the smell of damp wool mixed with smoke from the hearth until the room grew stifling. Hours passed, and what should have been a night of joy ended with Martha's infant lifeless, its form concealed swiftly in cloth by Wade herself. A neighbor, Jacob Pierce, swore he saw Wade fold the bundle tightly, pressing it close with a composure. That unsettled him more than the death itself. Pierce's account reached the ears of the town's magistrate, though no formal complaint followed. Death at birth was a cruel but familiar fact in those years, when fever, infection, and malnutrition left mothers weak. Yet what remained with Pierce was the sound, not the mother's sobbing nor the crackle of the fire, but the low scrape of Wade's chair as she pushed back from the bedside and walked away without offering words of comfort. That absence of human acknowledgement festered in his memory. By spring, 2 more families endured similar losses. In March, Sarah Clay's child was born with what witnesses called uncommon deformities of the limbs, though the midwife ordered the Shutters drawn before the neighbors could see clearly. The sound of iron latches closing against the daylight struck them as peculiar. One woman, Eliza Morton, later wrote in her journal that she heard Wade mutter something about shadows folding over the house. Eliza admitted she might have misheard, for the cries of Sarah Clay filled the cabin at that moment, but the phrase rooted itself in her recollection, repeated in her writing weeks later. The official records began to show their own pattern. In the leather-bound birth registry maintained by Clerk Amos Brewer, the entries of 1836 and 1837 bore a grim regularity. Next to Wade's name appeared the notation stillborn 3 times in succession, followed by infant expired within hour. Brewer's handwriting, normally steady, grew uneven by the 4th entry. His descendants, who preserved the registry, claimed he often commented that something in those cases unsettled him, though he never stated it outright. What spread through the community was not open accusation, but something more corrosive: apprehension. Neighbors began to notice details once overlooked. Wade's cabin, situated at the edge of the forest, rarely emitted smoke from its chimney, except on nights of delivery, when a thick column would rise and linger long after the event. Some claimed the air carried a faint, bitter odor of scorched herbs, clinging to their clothes even after they left. Others spoke of the way Wade walked, her steps deliberate and slow, as if time itself bent to her rhythm, drawing out moments of suffering longer than necessary. One telling moment came during a town gathering in the summer of 1837, when Wade attended with her medical satchel slung across her arm. The gathering was intended to mark the completion of a new mill on the river, but her presence turned eyes. As children played by the water, a neighbor approached her to ask about the loss of her own niece during birth. Rather than speak, Wade placed her hand upon the woman's wrist, pressing firmly, holding her gaze with an intensity that chilled. Witnesses remembered the neighbor falling silent mid-sentence, lowering her eyes as if ashamed. Whatever explanation she had sought never came. By autumn, a Cherokee interpreter named Daniel Ridgway recorded testimony from families on both sides of the frontier. He noted that the Cherokee women had given Eleanor Wade a name, Atsilvsky Ahive, translated as Mother of Shadows. Ridgway's notes, preserved in his ledger, described that the term did not derive from malice alone, but from fear of a presence that attended her work, as though she carried an unseen veil into each home. The ledger also mentioned that she was present during at least 2 births among displaced Cherokee families, and in both cases the infants did not survive beyond the first night. The physicality of her visits left indelible impressions. Doors left ajar during winter allowed gusts of freezing air to slice through cabins while Wade worked, chilling both mother and child. She insisted on dimming lamps until the rooms lay in a half-gloom, saying light confused the mother's breathing. The hush of these darkened interiors, broken only by the creak of floorboards under her weight, instilled dread in those present. Many could not articulate why they felt as though her presence thickened the air, pressing down upon their chests until words failed them. A turning point came in December 1837 with the birth of Rachel Bennett's child. The Bennett family was well respected, their homestead one of the largest in the valley. When Wade was called, the house filled with neighbors, curious and eager to celebrate. Yet those who entered reported that within an hour she had dismissed them all save for Rachel's husband and one attendant. The next morning the child was declared stillborn, its form concealed once again before the women waiting outside were permitted entry. Rachel herself was left pale and near death, unable to speak for days. What drew suspicion most was the account of the attendant, a servant named Mary Holloway, who later confided to her cousin that she had seen Wade place something small into her satchel before tending to the mother. Mary described it only as a bundle too small for clothing yet too heavy for herbs. When pressed, she claimed she heard a faint metallic clink as it was set within, a sound that haunted her. Sleep thereafter. By early 1838, murmurs reached the desk of Reverend Charles Whitfield, who kept a careful diary of community affairs. He wrote of being approached by 3 women after Sunday service, all recounting their unease with Wade's presence. One confessed she had begun to pray that her own pregnancy might end before labor so as not to require Wade's services. The Reverend noted that never in his years had he heard a mother voice such fear. His entry closed with the line, "There is a darkness about this woman that no scripture can ease." The escalation was subtle, yet relentless. 13 entries tied to Wade appeared in Brewer's registry by 1841, each marked by loss or abnormality. Each carried a date, a family name, a note of sorrow. Each carried silence afterward, the kind that settled like dust on rafters, invisible but heavy. The neighbors spoke of little else in hushed tones, for to accuse openly was to risk alienating the only midwife who might one day stand at their bedside. Yet every creak of her cabin door, every drift of smoke from her chimney, reminded them that another family might soon face what they already feared. Voce Gisi. Now continue with Chapter 1, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script beginning of the escalation. This part must contain between 100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly, Chapter 1, Part 2 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista Inglis Longa Horror Dice. The years that followed the first suspicions brought no relief. If anything, the weight of Eleanor Wade's reputation seemed to tighten its grip on the valley, binding families in a cycle of dependence and dread. For each home she entered, there remained the unspoken reality that she alone possessed the knowledge of childbirth, herbs, and instruments, a knowledge that could not easily be replaced in a remote region where trained physicians rarely ventured. The people tolerated her presence, even as unease sharpened with every story that drifted from one cabin to the next. By 1838, whispers had spread beyond the Appalachian ridges into nearby towns. Traveling merchants carried accounts along the wagon roads, repeating fragments of conversations overheard at taverns and markets. A man from Greene County swore he had spoken to a woman who described Wade's peculiar insistence on silence during labor. According to her, Wade would raise her hand whenever a mother cried too loudly, and the room would fall still, the cries swallowed as though they were shameful disruptions. The merchant said she compared the experience to being buried alive in soundless earth, a phrase that clung to those who heard it. The details of Wade's methods surfaced in fragments, like pieces of broken glass reflecting distorted truths. A farmer named Elias Howard recalled how she arrived at his home with bundles of cloth tied neatly with cord. He noticed the cloth carried a damp smell, as though soaked in a tincture, and when she laid them out, the pungent scent of bitter root filled the room. Howard claimed the odor lingered for days afterward, even after the infant was taken from their arms. His wife delivered a daughter who survived only 2 days, her skin marked by a bluish pallor that neighbors described as unnatural. When the child passed, Wade returned, collected her instruments, and left without ceremony. Howard wrote in his own ledger that her absence of mourning unsettled him more than the loss itself. At the same time, a Cherokee family displaced by the Treaty of New Ecota recorded an entry in their oral tradition, later transcribed by missionaries. It described a woman with hair like black smoke, who attended births during their forced march westward. The account did not accuse her directly, yet it noted that 3 children delivered under her hand entered the dark before the dawn. Whether the woman was Wade or another midwife remains uncertain, but the coincidence of timing and description added another shadow to her record. Clerk Amos Brewer, whose registry bore the marks of Wade's repeated failures, began keeping a separate notebook by 1839. This private record, not intended for public eyes, contained his reflections on the numbers that troubled him. "It cannot be chance," he wrote beside the tally of 13 names, each attached to a mother and a lost child. He underlined the figure 3 times, noting that other midwives in the region recorded no such frequency of stillbirths. Brewer wrote that he considered bringing the matter before the county court, but feared the consequences of making a charge. Without evidence beyond statistics, his hesitation preserved the silence that shielded Wade from scrutiny. Those who lived closest to her cabin noticed peculiar rhythms in her daily life. A neighbor, Thomas Greeley, told his son years later that Wade often walked the perimeter of her property at dawn, her steps crunching in the frost, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She carried a small lantern, though the light of morning made it unnecessary. Greeley remembered hearing the faint rattle of glass from her satchel, as if she carried vials wherever she went. He claimed that on several mornings he heard her speaking in a low voice, though no one else stood with her. Whether she prayed, chanted, or muttered instructions to herself remained unclear, but the sound unnerved him enough that he forbade his children from wandering near her fence. Inside the homes where she worked, physical traces lingered. Women reported finding small stains of dark fluid on linens that had not belonged to them. Others discovered shallow scratches on wooden tables where Wade had laid her instruments. One family swore they found a notch carved into the frame of their bed after her departure, as though marked deliberately. These remnants, though easily dismissed, accumulated into a pattern too distinct to ignore. A pivotal incident occurred in the spring of 1839, when Eleanor Wade attended the labor of Margaret Collins, the wife of a blacksmith. Margaret's screams carried across the valley, summoning neighbors who gathered at the door. What followed seared itself into memory. As the labor reached its peak, the cries ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence that pressed against the walls. Those outside swore they heard the sound of iron striking wood, a rhythmic tapping that continued for several minutes. When Wade emerged at dawn, she carried her satchel close to her chest, her face expressionless. The child was gone. Margaret survived, but when questioned later by her sister, she described the experience in fragmented words: darkness, cold cloth upon my mouth, then nothing. Her testimony circulated quietly, though no formal accusation was made. Margaret's husband, reliant on community goodwill, refused to speak against Wade openly. Yet the incident deepened the private conviction among many that something deliberate, not accidental, guided the deaths. In July of the same year, Reverend Whitfield attempted to intervene. He visited Wade at her cabin accompanied by 2 elders from his congregation. They described the interior as stark, the walls lined with shelves of jars filled with herbs, powders and liquids whose contents were unmarked. The air carried a pungent bitterness that stung the throat, forcing one elder to step outside. Whitfield noted in his diary that Wade greeted them with courtesy, yet her eyes remained fixed and unblinking, as if her attention resided elsewhere. When asked about the repeated tragedies, she answered only that nature does not grant life equally, and offered no further explanation. The men left unsettled, their purpose unfulfilled. Still, Wade's services remained sought. When a mother went into labor, hesitation gave way to necessity, and the midwife was called. Each birth became a moment of anxious calculation. Would this household escape the fate that had claimed so many? Others? Some mothers began to carry charms, small tokens of protection sewn into their clothing, hoping to ward off misfortune. Others begged their husbands to fetch physicians from distant towns, but the cost and distance proved prohibitive. For most, Wade was inevitable. The atmosphere of apprehension thickened further with the case of Anna Morton in late 1839. Anna delivered twins under Wade's supervision. According to the family's testimony, one infant survived while the other perished within minutes. Yet what disturbed them most was the midwife's reaction. Rather than tend to the living child, Wade focused her attention on the stillborn, wrapping it with care and tucking it into her satchel. Only when pressed by Anna's mother did she finally lift the surviving infant and hand it over, her expression unreadable. The family later confessed they felt as though she resented the one who lived. By 1840, murmurs had grown into hushed warnings. Young wives shared secrets in kitchens, their voices low over the crackle of firewood. Husbands debated in barns whether it was safer to risk the long ride for a physician than to trust Wade. Even children overheard fragments, repeating them in play with nervous laughter, calling one another Mother of Shadows when the sun fell. Fear had become part of the valley's rhythm, threading through daily life like smoke through rafters. Yet no decisive action was taken. The absence of proof, the reliance on Wade's skill, and the inertia of tradition bound the community in silence. Records accumulated, journals filled with uneasy notes, and the number 13 hung over the valley like a curse spoken but never named aloud. Each family waited, knowing that sooner or later their turn might come, and the midwife with the blood-stained apron would stand in their doorway once more. Voce Dis now continue with Chapter 2, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script escalation, where you will show how events become more disturbing and impossible to ignore. Introduce external figures, investigators, journalists, authorities, religious figures, and their first impressions. Add contradictions, disappearance of evidence, and conflicting accounts. Increase the tension with every sentence, preparing the viewer for the climax. This part must contain between 100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify: do not use full capital words, do not use forbidden characters, ditiudi. Taisu lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 2, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingalls Longa Horror, Dice. In the spring of 1840, the unease surrounding Eleanor Wade reached the ears of outsiders for the first time. A traveling physician from Philadelphia, Dr. Jonathan Hale, journeyed through the Appalachian settlements, offering vaccinations and rudimentary medical consultations. His reputation preceded him as a man of science and reason, trained in institutions that the mountain folk regarded with a mixture of awe and suspicion. When word spread that he would remain in the valley for several weeks, a few families, burdened with grief they dared not voice openly, sought him out to describe what they had witnessed at Wade's deliveries. Dr. Hale recorded his impressions in a journal that would later be deposited in the archives of a small medical college. His first entry mentioned the singular concentration of infant mortality attached to one name, Wade, and noted the peculiarity of consistent witness accounts describing the concealment of infants immediately after birth. He resolved to observe her methods, though not openly, fearing she would refuse his presence if confronted directly. Opportunity arrived sooner than expected. A farmer's wife, Martha Cook, went into labor in late April, and Wade was summoned as usual. Dr. Hale offered his assistance under the guise of professional courtesy. The midwife accepted, though reluctantly, and witnesses recalled her eyes lingering on him as though weighing his purpose. What followed unsettled Hale deeply. He observed that Wade dimmed the lamps until the cabin was cloaked in a shadowed haze, then pressed a cloth soaked in a pungent liquid against the mother's face. He described the odor as acrid, likely derived from belladonna or another toxic plant. When questioned, Wade dismissed his concerns, insisting it was to ease the mother's breathing. Hale noted the mother fell into a strange stupor, her cries reduced to muffled gasps, while Wade's hands worked swiftly, obscuring the birth from all present. By the end of the night, the child was declared stillborn. Hale later wrote that he attempted to examine the infant, but was denied, the body taken from the room before he could intervene. He concluded the account with a chilling line: "If there is guilt in this woman, it lies not in ignorance but in deliberate concealment." His journal, however, remained private, for he knew accusations without proof would be dismissed in the courts of the region, where superstition and silence outweighed evidence. Around the same time, another outsider entered the story, though from a different path. A journalist named Edwin Markham, working for a New York paper, had traveled south in search of accounts of Cherokee displacement and the hardships of frontier families. His reports often dwelled on the human cost of forced migration, the hunger and illness endured on the roads westward. Yet in one conversation with an interpreter, he heard of the Mother of Shadows, a woman who attended births marked by sorrow. Intrigued, Markham pursued the story with the skepticism of a city writer. He expected exaggeration or folklore, but what he encountered unsettled his rational mind. Markham interviewed several families under the guise of collecting stories of the valley. Their testimonies, while hesitant, revealed a disturbing consistency. Each spoke of Wade's habit of working in near darkness, of her refusal to allow neighbors to witness the infants after birth, and of the faint chemical smells that lingered in their homes long after she departed. Markham noted in his dispatch that these mountain folk, though unlearned, share too precise a pattern of memory for coincidence. Yet his editor refused to print the piece, deeming it sensational and unverifiable. The notes remained in Markham's private collection, forgotten by the public, but preserved as evidence of how deeply the suspicion had grown. By autumn of 1840, tensions rose when the body of a stillborn child was reportedly buried in haste near Wade's cabin, rather than in the family's plot. The family involved, the Turners, insisted they had entrusted the infant to Wade, only to discover days later that no grave was marked where she claimed it lay. When pressed, she dismissed their concerns, saying the child's form had been unsuitable for viewing and that she had given it rest herself. The absence of a marked burial disturbed the community, and some whispered that the ground near her cabin held more than herbs and tools. Yet no search was conducted for fear of trespassing and retribution. Reverend Whitfield, still troubled by his earlier visit, began to keep more detailed notes of the rumors. He wrote of contradictions that confused even him. Some claimed Wade's hands shook violently during deliveries, others swore they never trembled. Some said she wept when mothers lost children, while others insisted she showed no emotion at all. The inconsistency of accounts made it impossible to form a clear image of her. Whitfield wondered if fear itself was reshaping the memories of those who had suffered, turning grief into suspicion. Yet he could not dismiss the sheer number of cases tied to her name. Conflicting accounts also emerged in official records. Brewer's registry noted 13 cases by 1841, but when Hale attempted to cross-check them against burial records, discrepancies appeared. 3 infants listed as stillborn under Wade's care had no corresponding graves, at least none recorded in church or family plots. The absence of burial entries fueled speculation that the bodies had been concealed or disposed of without ceremony. Yet when Hale questioned the families, their answers wavered. Some claimed the infants had been interred quietly. Others admitted they did not know where Wade had taken them. The confusion deepened the mystery, creating a fog of half-truths that no one could pierce. Suspicion reached a breaking point during the labor of Hannah Price in early 1841. The delivery was long and grueling, and neighbors gathered at the door could hear every cry. Then, as so often before, silence fell abruptly, followed by the sound of Wade's boots on the floor. But this time, 2 women forced their way inside, despite her orders. What they saw left them shaken. Wade standing over the infant, her hands moving swiftly to wrap it before anyone could see its face. One woman swore she saw movement in the child's limbs before it was hidden, a detail that ignited whispers of deliberate suffocation. Wade ordered them out, her voice sharp and commanding, and the witnesses obeyed. When they later recounted what they had seen, their versions diverged in small but crucial details, making their testimony vulnerable to doubt. By mid-1841, the valley no longer held its suspicions in silence. Meetings were held in barns and taverns, with men debating whether to petition the county court. Some argued that without clear proof, they risked condemning a woman who had served them for years. Others, driven by grief and fear, demanded her removal. Yet every attempt to act stalled in uncertainty, undone by contradictions, missing evidence, and the community's dependence on her skill. The escalation of unease was not confined to the valley alone. A letter preserved in the county archives reveals that the magistrate himself received anonymous warnings about Wade, written in a hand so unsteady it suggested both fear and haste. The letter urged him to investigate the ground near her cabin, to demand inspection of her satchel, to account for the missing infants. Yet no such investigation followed. Whether through negligence, intimidation, or simple inertia, the matter was left unresolved. By the close of 1841, the name Eleanor Wade had become more than a midwife's title. It was a boundary of dread, a shadow that stretched across the valley's births, binding every new mother in a net of uncertainty. Outsiders who touched the case left with unease but no proof. Families who grieved found themselves unable to agree on what they had seen. Records contradicted, bodies vanished, and words faltered in the face of fear. The escalation was undeniable, yet no resolution appeared. Only the sense that something deliberate, perhaps unspeakable, lurked beneath the veil of ordinary tragedy. Vocidis, now continue with Chapter 2, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Escalation. This part must contain between 1,100 and 500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 2, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingles longa horror dice. By 1842, the unease that had seeped quietly through the valleys began to take a more visible shape. Small gestures betrayed the community's fear. Doors barred at night when Wade was seen walking past, shutters drawn if her lantern appeared at the edge of a property, mothers clutching rosaries or whispered prayers as their pregnancies advanced. The silence that had once shielded her now cracked, and what emerged was a patchwork of accusations, contradictions, and half-truths. One of the first open confrontations occurred when Samuel Pierce, a mill worker, accused Wade of negligence after the loss of his second child under her care. At the gathering that followed Sunday service, he spoke aloud what many had only whispered, that Wade had placed a cloth over his wife's face, muttered instructions no one understood, and carried the infant away before the family could look upon it. His words carried weight because he was not known as a man prone to exaggeration. Yet almost immediately, another neighbor interrupted, declaring that Pierce's account was flawed, for he himself had seen Wade kneel in prayer after the stillbirth, weeping quietly as she wrapped the child. The congregation split, some nodding in agreement, others dismissing the story as grief twisting memory. The contradictions muddied the air like smoke, impossible to clear. The confusion deepened when an attempt was made to retrieve official documentation. A clerk in a neighboring county, responding to inquiries from Reverend Whitfield, reported that several burial entries tied to Wade's deliveries were missing altogether from church records. Yet days later, the same clerk produced slips of parchment bearing the missing names, claiming they had been misfiled. The ink on some appeared fresher than expected, raising suspicion that the records had been altered after the fact. Whether through carelessness or deliberate tampering, the result was the same. Evidence that might have confirmed suspicions dissolved into uncertainty. Journalist Edwin Markham, still lingering in the region, wrote in his notebook that he felt as though truth itself is being unstitched before my eyes. He recorded accounts from two families whose stories directly contradicted each other. The first claimed Wade had refused to let them hold their child, insisting the infant was malformed beyond recognition. The second insisted she had forced the grieving mother to hold the dead child, pressing the bundle into her arms until the woman fainted. Markham noted that both families spoke with conviction, their grief raw, their memories certain. Yet their stories were irreconcilable. He concluded that the terror surrounding Wade had grown so strong that memory itself could no longer be trusted. While contradictions muddled the human testimonies, physical traces continued to raise questions. Farmers reported finding small pits of freshly turned earth in the woods near Wade's cabin, too shallow to be for crops, too numerous to be explained away. When asked, Wade told one family she buried unused herbs in the soil to prevent sickness. Others believed the ground held infants whose families had been denied the right to grieve. No search was ever sanctioned, though boys who roamed the forest claimed to have seen scraps of cloth protruding from the earth, half hidden under leaves. Into this climate stepped a county investigator, Thomas Alden, dispatched after mounting petitions reached the magistrate. Alden was not a physician, but a former constable, accustomed to disputes over property, theft, and violence, not matters of childbirth. He arrived with little more than a ledger, a quill, and a determination to impose order. His first visits were methodical: interviews with families, examination of records, quiet walks around Wade's cabin. He noted the bitterness of the air within her home, describing it as a stench that clung to his throat long after leaving. He remarked on the jars lining her shelves, many unmarked, some containing substances he could not identify. Yet when he attempted to collect samples, Wade barred him, claiming they were personal remedies and not subject to inspection. Alden's early notes suggest he believed the rumors exaggerated. He wrote that the families were too eager to find a villain for their grief, and that Wade's composure might have been mistaken for cruelty. But as he compiled testimony, patterns emerged he could not ignore. The recurring details of dimmed lamps, of cloth soaked in pungent liquid, of infants whisked away before they could be seen, appeared too often to dismiss as invention. Still, when Alden attempted to retrieve physical evidence, it seemed always just beyond reach. Records vanished, graves went unmarked, families contradicted each other, and Wade herself maintained an impenetrable calm. One evening, Alden returned to the Cook family, hoping to review their account in greater detail. To his surprise, Martha Cook retracted part of her earlier testimony, claiming she had been mistaken about Wade's use of cloths. She insisted now that she remembered no such detail. Alden, perplexed, recorded that her husband appeared tense during the exchange, his eyes fixed on the floor. The investigator suspected pressure, perhaps even intimidation, had influenced her sudden change of memory. Yet he could not prove it. Meanwhile, Reverend Whitfield pressed Alden to pursue the matter further. He provided the investigator with copies of his diaries, pages filled with careful notations of whispered fears, rumors of missing infants, and contradictory testimonies. Alden, though skeptical of a clergyman's subjective impressions, admitted the volume of entries revealed a breadth of unease, too widespread to dismiss. He wrote that Whitfield's records were a map of fear, though the terrain remains obscured. The contradictions reached their most dangerous level with the case of Rebecca Lane in late 1842. During her labor, several women insisted they heard a cry from the infant before Wade declared it stillborn. One claimed she saw its chest rise and fall. Another swore she heard a faint whimper, but Wade silenced them, covering the bundle swiftly and ordering them from the room. When Alden questioned these witnesses, their accounts diverged in crucial ways. One woman insisted the infant cried for a full minute, another claimed it was no more than a gasp, while a third admitted she may have mistaken the sound of the wind. Rattling the shutters. By the time their testimonies reached the magistrate, they had lost coherence. Markham, ever the recorder, described the valley in those months as a place where memory has become a battlefield. He wrote that grief warped accounts, fear silenced others, and the few willing to speak openly soon contradicted themselves under pressure. He concluded that if Wade was guilty, she had been shielded not by innocence, but by the very instability of human recollection. The effect on the community was corrosive. Families turned against one another, accusing neighbors of inventing or suppressing details. Taverns erupted in arguments, with men shouting over whether Wade was a healer unfairly maligned or a danger tolerated too long. Women exchanged hurried whispers, some swearing they would flee the valley before calling her, others admitting they had no choice but to submit should labor come. Trust, once the glue of frontier life, began to fracture. Amid this collapse, Wade herself remained unchanged. She moved through the valley with the same deliberate steps, her shawl drawn close, her satchel in hand. Neighbors observed her eyes scanning the ground as if searching for something unseen. She spoke little, her words measured and calm as though untouched by the storm surrounding her. That composure, more than anything, deepened suspicion. For while grief raged in every cabin she entered, she alone seemed immune to it, her silence a wall no one could breach. By the year's end, Alden submitted a report to the magistrate. It contained no accusation, only an acknowledgement of irregularities in record, uncertainty of testimony, and the persistence of fear. It recommended no action, citing lack of evidence. With that, the official inquiry ended. But the valley was left in a state of raw unrest, its people suspended between certainty and doubt, compelled to rely still upon the very woman they feared most. The escalation had reached a fever pitch, and yet nothing had changed. The shadows remained, growing heavier with each birth, each disappearance of evidence, each voice that faltered in contradiction. The truth lay obscured, and Eleanor Wade continued her work, untouched by the storm that swirled around her name. Você disse, now continue with Chapter 3, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script confrontation or discovery. Report the most intense and revealing moment, discovery of bodies, files, forbidden objects, hidden rooms, etc. Describe every visual and auditory detail realistically, avoiding gratuitous gore but not concealing the gravity. Show the reactions of witnesses and authorities in the face of the revealed horror. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary. Summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 roteirista inglés longa horror dice. Pensó por 27s. The turning point came in the late summer of 1843, when a storm swept across the valley, its rains loosening the soil near Wade's cabin. After 2 days of heavy downpour, children wandering in the woods discovered a patch of earth caved in, revealing what looked like fragments of cloth rising through the mud. Startled by the sight, they called for their fathers, and within hours a crowd had gathered at the edge of Wade's property. The air carried the smell of wet leaves and turned soil, mingling with something sharper, a rancid sweetness that clung to the throat. When the first spade struck the softened ground, the sound was dull, muffled by waterlogged earth. Soon the digging revealed more cloth, twisted and stained, bound tightly as though concealing small forms. Gasps rose from the crowd as the bundles emerged, each no larger than an infant, wrapped with a precision that betrayed deliberate hands. No one spoke at first. The rain had ceased, but water dripped from branches above, the steady rhythm punctuating the silence. Alden, recalled from his duties after the discovery, was summoned to witness the excavation. He arrived with 2 deputies, lanterns casting narrow beams across the clearing as dusk settled. The investigator removed his hat, swallowed, and gave the order to continue. The spades moved with a grim cadence, pulling up sodden bundles that slid heavily onto the ground. One man crossed himself. Another stepped back and retched quietly behind a tree. The children were sent away, though their curiosity held them just out of sight, faces pale in the dim light. Alden refused to allow the bundles to be opened in the clearing. He ordered them placed gently in a cart, lined with canvas, and taken to the magistrate's storehouse, a dry structure with a sturdy table and shutters that could be closed against prying eyes. The crowd followed at a distance, a somber procession along the muddy track. Not a word passed between them. Only the steady creak of the cart wheels and the soft slap of wet leather against the horse's flanks filled the air. Inside the storehouse, the smell intensified. A deputy set a lantern on the table, its flame wavering, and Alden cut the cords on the first cloth with a knife whose blade shook in his hand. He drew back the fabric slowly. What lay within was small and still, the features barely formed, the skin waxen from time in the earth. There was no need for detail. The gravity of the sight spoke for itself. The second bundle revealed a similar form, and the third and the fourth. Alden stood rigid, eyes fixed, jaw set as he counted them in a voice stripped of inflection. When he reached 7, he stopped, pressed a hand to his throat, and ordered the shutters open to let air in. Reverend Whitfield arrived unbidden, as if drawn by the rumors that flew from the clearing to the town square. He stepped inside, saw the table, and faltered. He had counseled grieving parents for years, but this arrangement of small, silent shapes, each bound with care and hidden underground, broke him in a way sermons could not mend. He placed a hand on the table, fingertips brushing the damp cloth, and whispered a prayer that did not rise above a breath. The deputy who had carried the cart from the cabin wiped his eyes on his sleeve. He said he had seen markers for livestock, but never for this. Alden ordered him to fetch a ledger. The investigator began to document each bundle with a number, a description of the wrapping, the condition of the cloth. He spoke in short, steady phrases, clinging to procedure as if it were a rope above deep water. By nightfall, word had reached Dr. Jonathan Hale, who had returned to the region at Markham's urging. Hale arrived with a bag of instruments and a grim familiarity with sorrow, yet his face still drained when he saw the table. He examined each small form with the gentleness of a physician who understood that the dead still deserved dignity. He noted the bindings, the care with which the limbs had been folded, the cloth pulled tight across the chest. He drew a long breath and said only that he could not determine cause in the storehouse light. He would need a quieter room, more light and time. Wade herself did not appear at the storehouse. She remained at her cabin, which now stood ringed by neighbors who kept their distance, as if the house itself radiated a chill. A single lamp glowed behind a shutter. Many expected her to flee, yet she did not. She did not speak. She did not step outside. The silence coming from her dwelling felt intentional, a refusal to cede even a word to the tide closing around her. At dawn, Alden led a small party back to the cabin with a warrant from the magistrate. The warrant permitted inspection of outbuildings and grounds. It did not authorize a search of Wade's personal effects, but Alden reasoned that the discovery of unmarked graves warranted a broader look. The group approached the door together, boots scuffing the damp threshold, breath pluming in the cool morning air. Alden knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. The latch lifted from the inside, and the door opened on a dark interior, a smell of dried herbs and old smoke. Wade stood in the center of the room, shawl wrapped tight, satchel at her feet. Alden read the warrant aloud. His voice echoed slightly against the bare boards, and a floorboard near the hearth creaked with the shifting of weight. Wade neither protested nor invited them to enter. She merely stepped aside and watched. The deputies crossed the threshold, eyes adjusting. Shelves lined the walls crowded with jars. Some held leaves and roots, others contained fluids of amber and pale green. A mortar and pestle sat on a table beside lengths of clean cloth, folded with careful precision. What drew Hale's attention was a cabinet fitted with a simple brass lock. He asked for the key. Wade's face did not change, but she reached into her apron pocket and produced a small ring. The key turned with a click that sounded unnaturally loud in the room. Inside the cabinet lay a row of instruments wrapped in oiled linen. Hale unrolled them one by one, the metal glinting faintly in the grey light. He saw shears, clamps, and devices he did not recognize, their edges honed to a fine line. Some bore faint stains that time had darkened. Hale's jaw tightened. He asked permission to examine them further. Alden granted it, and the doctor bent close, his breath held, as though proximity alone might reveal intention. On the lowest shelf of the cabinet lay a slim ledger bound in cracked leather. Alden opened it, the pages stiff. Inside, the handwriting was small and compact, each entry marked by a date, a family name, a set of notes rendered in a clinical tone. He read fragments aloud. Difficulty of breathing, cord tied. Bleeding controlled. A mark beside the word stillness appeared repeatedly, a small circle in the margin. Alden recognized the dates as those recorded by Brewer, but the ledger contained more. Some entries had no corresponding record in the clerk's book. Several mentioned work performed outside a family home, identified only by the words, private place. The room tightened with that phrase. Whitfield crossed himself, though his faith rarely led him to gestures. Hale looked up from the instruments and met Alden's eyes, a question unspoken. Alden responded by calling for a deputy to record every line, every jar, every instrument. Wade had not moved. She watched them in silence, her gaze drifting not to the ledger, not to the instruments but to the hearthstones, as if listening for something beneath them. Alden noticed. He moved to the hearth and tapped the stones with the butt of his knife. The second stone from the left gave a hollow sound. Hale stepped closer. Whitfield held his breath. Alden pried at the edge with the blade until the stone lifted, revealing darkness and the smell of cold earth. He held the lantern over the opening. A narrow cavity, not wide enough for a person, had been carved beneath the hearth. Within lay more cloth bundles, their surfaces dry and dusted with ash. Beside them lay glass vials corked tight, the residue inside dried to a thin ring. Hale reached in with a cloth wrapped around his hand and drew one out. The vial carried a label in Wade's neat script, nightshade extract. Another read ergot preparation. A third bore no label at all. The deputies stepped back, one of them cursing under his breath, another closing a hand over his mouth. Whitfield spoke a single word: mercy. Alden closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and ordered the cavity cleared. Each bundle was lifted with care, placed on the table where the instruments had been. Hale did not open them. He did not need to. The weight and form were familiar. He instead uncorked the labeled vials and brought them cautiously to his nose. He did not inhale deeply, only enough to confirm the scent. He nodded once and set them down. Alden turned to Wade and asked for an explanation. She answered in a voice that had not trembled since the first knock on her door. She said the herbs were medicines meant to ease pain when pain grew unbearable. She said not every child could be brought into this world fit to endure it. She said the bundles were the result of work done in kindness, in the absence of men who understood nothing of the agony they demanded women bear. Her words did not rise. They did not fall. She spoke as if reciting a set of instructions learned long ago. The room reacted as a single body. Whitfield stepped back as if struck. A deputy whispered a prayer. Hale's face hardened, the compassion in his eyes eclipsed by a cold resolve. Alden did not debate her. He asked only whether families had consented to what she had done. Wade did not answer. Her silence entered the room like a weight. Markham, who had arrived with his notebook clenched in his hand, wrote furiously, ink blotting where the nib lingered too long. He recorded the hollow beneath the hearth, the vials, the ledger with its circles in the margin. He described the way dust motes drifted in the lantern light like ash, the way the boards groaned under shifting feet, the way the air tasted of bitter herbs and damp stone. He wrote that the midwife watched a portion of her life laid out on a table as if it were a map, and that her expression revealed nothing of remorse or pride, only a terrible certainty. Alden closed the cabinet, replaced the hearthstone and ordered the cabin secured. He declared the property under guard, and the owner bound to remain within sight until a formal hearing could be convened. Whitfield attempted to speak to Wade, to appeal to any remnant of pity within her. She looked at him as if he were a man standing at a great distance, his words lost in the wind. Outside, the crowd had gathered again, drawn by the rumor that the cabin held more than jars and cloth. When Alden emerged to address them, the faces he saw were grey with fatigue and apprehension. He announced that evidence had been found, and that further examination would be conducted in the presence of the magistrate. He did not give details. He did not need to. A sound moved through the crowd, not a cheer, not a cry, but a long breath, as if a valley exhaling after holding fear too long in its chest. That night, the storehouse filled once more. Hale worked by lamplight with a measured hand, examining each vial, listing contents, noting the ledger's entries against the dates in Brewer's registry. He found tinctures common to midwifery, but also preparations so potent that a few drops would slow a pulse to stillness. He took no risks, touching liquids only with cloths, sealing them again with wax. He paused when he reached the entries marked private place, his finger resting on a date that matched a family whose infant had no recorded burial. He whispered the name into the dim room, as if speaking it might summon clarity. Whitfield remained at the table for hours, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the bundled shapes he refused to see unwrapped. He prayed without words. Markham sat nearby, pens running dry as he chronicled each measured step of the examination, knowing that what he wrote might never see print, yet compelled to set it down all the same. Alden moved among them, a restless presence, checking locks, counting bundles, comparing lists, insisting on procedure not to comfort himself, but to keep the room from sliding into the helplessness that had ruled the valley for years. Near midnight, when fatigue had thinned their voices to whispers, a deputy entered with a small item found in the cabin's cabinet. He held it in a cloth and placed it before Alden. It was a simple wooden stamp, the surface carved with a tiny circle. Alden turned it in the lamplight, then lifted the ledger and found the small ring in the margin beside stillness. He pressed the stamp gently into an ink pad and tested it on a scrap. The circle matched. Hale closed his eyes. Whitfield bowed his head. No one spoke while the lantern hummed, a low sound like breath held too long. The discovery did not end the matter. It opened it. The next day would bring questions of law and testimony, of who had known and who had chosen not to know. But in that moment, surrounded by the quiet of the storehouse and the soft ticking of the cooling lantern glass, the reality lay before them. In objects and marks that could not be argued away. The jars, the ledger, the hidden hollow beneath the hearth, the bundles lifted from the earth with rain still clinging to their cloth. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, as if time had paused to witness the truth at last stepping into view. Você diz, now continue with Chapter 3, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Confrontation or Discovery. This part must contain between 1,100 and 500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, do not lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 3, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roteirista, Ingles longa hora dice. The following morning, the magistrate convened an emergency session inside the old courthouse, a drafty structure of rough-hewn timbers, where the smell of damp parchment and oil lamps filled the air. The valley's men crowded the benches, hats clutched in their hands, while women gathered outside the doors, straining to hear. The bundles recovered from Wade's hearth, and the freshly unearthed graves were not displayed, but everyone present knew of them. Their existence hung over the room like a shadow, heavier than the silence. Heldon presented his findings with a voice stripped of ornament. He described the hidden cavity beneath the hearth, the ledger marked with circles beside the word stillness, the vials labeled with potent extracts, and the bundles buried in soil, softened by rain. He avoided conjecture. His words were spare, measured, and precise. Each detail deepened the unease pressing against the walls until even the magistrate shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Dr. Hale was called next. He stepped forward with his physician's bag resting at his side, his spectacles fogged from the heat of the crowded room. He testified that the substances found in Wade's possession were capable of inducing unconsciousness, of stilling an infant's breathing, of halting a pulse. He stopped short of declaring intent, but his tone left little doubt. His hands shook once as he turned a vial in the lamplight. He said he had seen its contents used in hospitals as poisons rather than medicines. A murmur rippled through the benches, quickly silenced by the magistrate's gavel. Reverend Whitfield followed, his presence solemn, his diary clasped tightly in his hand. He spoke not as a man of law, but as one who had listened to the valley's grief. He read passages written in his careful script, mothers who confessed to fearing their own pregnancies, fathers who spoke of seeing their infants whisked away before they could touch them, neighbors who whispered of cloth bundles carried in Wade's satchel. He closed the book and said only that silence had served death too long. His words were heavy, deliberate, and when he returned to his seat no one spoke for several minutes. At last the magistrate ordered that Wade herself be brought before the assembly. She entered flanked by deputies, her shawl drawn tight, her face pale but expressionless. The crowd shifted as she passed, men straightening their backs, women outside craning to see her through the narrow windows. She took her place before the magistrate, her satchel absent for the first time in memory. When asked to answer the charges, Wade did not falter. Her voice was calm, her tone deliberate, as she repeated the words she had spoken in her cabin, that not all children were fit to endure the world, that her work was an act of mercy, that pain was not to be prolonged when it could be quieted. She did not weep. She did not plead. She stated her case with the certainty of someone who believed the truth of her own reasoning. The room reacted as if struck. Some gasped aloud, others muttered prayers, while one man shouted that she had no right to decide the fate of any child. Deputies moved quickly to quiet the commotion. The magistrate demanded order, though his own hands trembled as he gripped the bench. He pressed her further, asking if families had ever given consent. She looked at him steadily and said, "Consent is a word of men, not of women in labor." Her answer froze the room into silence. Markham, scribbling in his notebook at the back, described the moment as one in which the weight of years of secrecy pressed into a single sentence. He noted the way the crowd's breathing grew audible, the scrape of boots against the floor, the faint hiss of a lamp drawing oil. He wrote that Wade seemed untouchable, as though the storm of accusation broke against her without denting her resolve. The confrontation did not end in verdict. The magistrate adjourned the session, citing the need for further inquiry. But he ordered Wade confined under guard in a house at the edge of town. The deputies led her out through a corridor of eyes, the crowd parting reluctantly. Some spat in the dirt as she passed. Others stood motionless, caught between outrage and dread. She walked with the same deliberate steps as always, her shawl drawn close, her gaze never shifting. That night, guards stationed outside her quarters reported a strange stillness. She neither ate nor spoke. The only sound they noted was the occasional scratch of a quill on paper. At dawn, Alden entered to inspect and found a sheet on the table filled with her tight, deliberate handwriting. The words were not confession nor defense, but instructions: herbs for easing fever, mixtures for calming cough, remedies for swelling. At the bottom she had written only, "For those who will listen." Alden folded the paper and placed it in his coat without comment. Meanwhile, the storehouse became a place of grim pilgrimage. Families arrived to ask whether their names appeared in the ledger. Alden refused to let them see the bundles, but he allowed some to confirm the dates. Mothers left weeping, fathers silent, their suspicions hardened into certainty. The ledger became a mirror in which grief found shape, each entry pulling the valley deeper into the confrontation it could no longer avoid. Hale continued his examinations, his notes increasingly meticulous. He measured the sizes of the forms, recorded the bindings, catalogued the substances in the vials. He grew pale and thinner with each passing day, his hands often stained with ink and herb residue. He confided to Whitfield that what disturbed him most was not the presence of poisons, but their precision. The quantities suggested calculation, not accident. "She knew," he whispered, his voice breaking. She knew exactly what she was doing. Markham's dispatches, though unprinted, spread in handwritten copies across neighboring counties. Farmers in distant hamlets began speaking of the Mother of Shadows, as if she were a figure of both dread and warning. Some called for justice, others for mercy, but all agreed that the valley's secret had spilled beyond its borders. The confrontation was no longer confined to one community. It was becoming a story carried by riverboats and stagecoaches, whispered in taverns, and written into private journals hundreds of miles away. Back in the courthouse, Alden prepared to present his findings to the circuit judge. He gathered the ledger, the vials, the instruments, and the testimony of Hale and Whitfield. Yet even as he worked, contradictions continued to haunt the case. Some families, when called to testify, faltered in their certainty, insisting they had misremembered details or could not swear under oath. Others contradicted one another outright, leaving Alden frustrated. He wrote in his notes that truth had become a candle flickering in wind, its light seen differently by every eye that beholds it. The tension reached a breaking point during one final inspection of Wade's cabin. Alden, Hale, and Whitfield returned with deputies to search for anything they had missed. In the loft above her main room, beneath boards that creaked under their weight, they discovered a small chest bound with iron clasps. When opened, it revealed scraps of fabric, some blood-stained, others singed as though scorched by flame. Among them lay more pages of notes in Wade's hand, listing names without dates, each marked with the same circular stamp. The pages bore no explanation, only the repetition of that single haunting symbol. Whitfield collapsed into a chair, head bowed. Hale closed the chest with a snap, his face ashen. Alden took the pages, added them to his packet of evidence, and gave no comment. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, as if they had stepped too close to something that could not be undone. The discovery sealed the confrontation. The valley could no longer pretend, no longer silence its doubts with talk of chance or misfortune. The bundles, the vials, the ledger, the stamped pages, all stood as stark reminders that beneath the quiet steps of a midwife, a darker record had been written into the soil, into the walls of cabins, into the lives of families who would carry the weight forever. When Alden left the cabin for the last time, he paused at the threshold. The morning sun slanted through the trees, catching on the damp earth where rain had washed away the topsoil. He looked back once at the dark interior where shelves of jars still lined the walls and felt the weight of a truth that would follow him long after the case was closed. He stepped outside, closed the door and ordered it sealed. The sound of the latch falling into place echoed against the clearing, a sharp, final note that seemed to settle over the valley like judgment itself. Você disse, now continue with Chapter 4, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script consequences and legacy. Report the outcome, arrests, closures, trials, political or social changes. Show how the community and collective memory dealt with the case in the following years. Conclude with an enigmatic and unsettling final sentence that leaves a lingering doubt in the viewer's mind. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, do not lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 4, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Rotirista. Inglés longa horror dice, pensó por 44 horas news of the storehouse, and the sealed cabin reached the county seat before the wagons bearing the evidence arrived. A deputy rode ahead at dawn to summon the circuit judge, and by evening a warrant for arrest had been issued. Eleanor Wade was taken quietly from the guarded house at the edge of town and led to the lockup behind the courthouse. The cell was narrow and smelled of damp mortar, a place meant for drunks and brawlers, rather than a midwife whose hands had greeted nearly every new life in the valley for a decade. She accepted the iron key turning behind her with the same calm she had shown before the magistrate, then sat on the wooden bench and folded her hands in her shawl. The county called a special session 2 weeks later. The judge, a man more accustomed to land disputes than matters of life and death, ordered that the jars, the instruments, the ledger and the cloth bundles remain under seal until expert examination could be completed. Dr. Hale took a table in the courthouse annex and worked in near silence, recording measurements and compiling a list of substances. He documented tinctures of nightshade and ergot, recorded their strengths, and compared those notes to the pages marked with the circular stamp. His report, when submitted, spoke of calculated quantities and repeated application, enough to slow a pulse, numb breath, and still movement. He stopped short of naming intent. He wrote only of what was present, and what such preparations could do. In early spring of 1844 the trial began. The benches filled again, but this time the air held the charged stillness that follows a storm. The prosecutor spoke first, a man with a firm voice and a stack of county statutes at his elbow. He argued that Wade had concealed births, disposed of bodies without lawful burial, and administered dangerous substances without consent. He lifted the ledger and read names in a slow cadence, the dates and the small circle marked beside stillness. He held up the wooden stamp. Every head turned, every throat tightened. The defense answered with a force that surprised those who expected a meek plea. Wade's advocate, a lawyer borrowed from a neighboring county, brought forth pamphlets and letters from physicians who wrote of ergot's use to stanch bleeding and speed. Labor, of nightshade in minute doses to calm spasms and ease agony. He called for an understanding of a midwife's work in cabins, where physicians seldom arrived in time. He gestured to the jars and argued that what appeared sinister to a constable might be the tools of mercy to a woman standing between life and death. Witnesses followed, each voice a stone dropped into the same dark water. Brewer admitted that pages had gone missing from his registry, though he could not say when. The clerk from a neighboring parish arrived with newly found burial notes, the ink suspiciously fresh, which he apologized for misfiling. Families took the stand and faltered. Some remembered cloth pressed to faces, others denied it. Some heard a cry, others only whined at the shutters. The prosecutor's case moved forward by inches, then lost ground to hesitation and contradiction. When Hale spoke, the room leaned forward. He explained the potency of the tinctures, described the precision of the preparations, and testified that quantities of this strength, when applied to an infant or a mother already weakened, would quiet. Breath to a vanishing point, the defense cross-examined with care. Was it possible that the remedies had been meant to prevent bleeding and pain? Could a midwife without formal training misjudge a dose? Hale answered with restraint. Yes, such medicines existed in the borderland between cure and harm. Yes, error was possible. He would not speak the word murder. He repeated that his testimony described capability and effect. Haldon followed with a steady recitation of the search, the hollow beneath the hearth, the discovery of the vials, the stamped pages in the loft chest. The defense pressed him on the breadth of the warrant. He admitted its language had not specified a search of personal papers, that he had used his discretion when the hearthstone sounded hollow. The judge frowned but allowed the evidence, noting the gravity of what had been uncovered. On the third day, Wade herself was led to the stand. She did not confess. She did not withdraw. She spoke of pain and fear in cabins where the lamp burned low and time thinned to a thread. She said she had seen suffering that no court could imagine, and that she had learned which herbs drove death away and which welcomed it when the child was not fit for this earth. She would not say who had asked and who had only wept. She would not speak of consent. Her words neither begged nor defied. They landed like stones, and every ear felt their weight. The verdict came slowly, shaped by statute rather than certainty. The judge declared that the court could not convict on charges of murder, without a witness who had seen the act, or a confession naming intent. He did find her guilty of unlawful concealment of births and violation of burial duties. He barred her from the practice of midwifery within the county, and sentenced her to confinement of 3 years in the county jail, with the term to include instruction for the registrar and the church in the proper recording of births and burials. The sentence satisfied no one. Some called it a scandal. Others called it the only path the law allowed. The immediate consequence was absence. No one remained to catch the children of the valley. Panic followed, then improvisation. Women formed circles in kitchens, pooling what they remembered from mothers and grandmothers. A physician from a larger town was hired to make rounds on horseback when called, his fees paid from a fund raised by farmers and millers who had never agreed on anything before. The churchyard set aside a small square for infant burials, with marked stones and a ledger kept under lock. The register required 2 signatures after each birth, one from a family member and one from a minister or physician when available. Brewer's new book bore a heavy cover and a chain to the wall. He logged every entry twice, once in ink and once in pencil, and invited any mother who asked to read the lines bearing her child's name. Beyond the valley, the story traveled. Markham, unable to print in his paper, sent reports to a friend in Philadelphia, who carried them to a medical college where Hale had trained. In 1845, the college library accepted a packet labeled from the Appalachia case. It contained Hale's testimony, Alden's inventory of instruments and jars, a copy of Whitfield's diary entries, and the ledger with its circles dutifully noted in the margins. The college debated whether to teach from the packet. Some argued it was unfit for students. Others claimed that caution had to be learned from the darkest examples. The packet was shelved with a discreet label and a locked clasp. It remains listed as a collection of obstetrical notes, anonymous, the handwriting easily recognized by anyone who has turned its pages. Within the county, a new ordinance was drafted in 1845. It required midwives to register their names with the clerk and to keep a log of every labor attended, with the signature of a family member and a mark from the local minister. It stipulated that no tincture stronger than a specified measure could be carried without a physician's signed instruction. The law did not end risk, but it pushed secrecy to the edges. When a woman arrived at a cabin with a satchel of bottles, she knew that the pages waiting at the clerk's desk would expect her handwriting before the month was out. Wade served her sentence without incident. She read the paper in the mornings, wrote lists of remedies for the jailer's wife, and taught 2 young women how to measure a pulse at the wrist. Hale visited once and found her seated by a window that looked onto a yard where a single ash tree grew. They spoke of cases they had shared, of women who had survived when all signs pointed the other way, of the narrow ground between easing pain and ending breath. She asked him if the packet to Philadelphia had been received. He said yes. She nodded and returned to her view. Their meeting ended with no forgiveness and no apology. The valley adjusted with the stubbornness of places that endure. Babies were born under the eyes of mothers and cousins, with the kitchen lamp burning brighter than Wade had ever allowed. Men stood in doorways, cowed by the small sounds of new breathing, some whispering prayers they barely remembered. The churchyard's new section grew not from malice, but because mortality still walked the hills. The difference was that the graves had names and dates, and the ledger did not hide behind a cabinet door. Whitfield's sermons turned to the virtues of witness and the sin of silence. He spoke plainly of the duty to record what was seen, and to accept that grief does not absolve the living from truth. He never named her from the pulpit, yet the shape of her absence sat beside every reading. When he died in 1846, his diary passed to the church elders, who resolved that its pages would be kept in the same chest as the register, where anyone might ask to read them. Markham's notes, copied and recopied, became a cautionary tale in towns that shared no river and no mountain with the valley. The copies drifted to boarding houses and meeting halls, took on small changes, lost the precision of dates, gained moral comments no witness had spoken, yet the core remained. A midwife, a ledger, a circle stamped in margin, men and women who looked away, then looked too late. Some spoke of her as a monster. Others called her a product of isolation and cruel necessity. A few, quieter, whispered that she had done what some mothers in secret had asked of her when no one else would listen. The county never answered that question in law or in conscience. It only closed the cabin, shuttered the windows, and posted a notice that no one was to enter. Children dared one another to touch the latch and run. The door held fast against their hands. When Wade left custody in the final month of 1846, she did not return to the valley roads. A carriage took her east under guard to meet relatives who had written on her behalf. She carried no satchel. She took no instruments. The clerk released to her only a small parcel of clothing and a book of psalms that had gathered dust on the jailhouse shelf. At the station yard, a woman stepped forward to offer her a cloak against the cold. Wade accepted it with a small nod and turned her face toward the city. Hale filed one last note in the packet before it left for Philadelphia. He dated it carefully and wrote in a hand steadier than the year before. He summarized no argument and named no crime. He observed only that systems change slowly, that fear changes even more slowly, and that paper, when marked, can bind a community to its answer or reveal its refusal to answer. He closed the folder and tied the string. Years later, people would disagree on what had truly been proven, on what had only been suspected, on what had been feared into existence by grief. The cabin rotted at the sills, and the ash tree by the jail yard grew tall, throwing shade on a bench where a midwife once sat with folded hands. In the clerk's vault, the new register thickened, heavy with signatures and dates, its chain humming softly when opened. And in a Philadelphia library, a student checking a shelf for a borrowed volume found a slip of paper pressed into the binding of a different book, a tiny circle stamped in the corner, and no one could say whose hand had set it. There. Você disse, Now continue with Chapter 4, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Consequences and Legacy. This part must contain between 100 and 1500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. Attention. This is the final part of the script. This structure is mandatory. No exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of Chapter 4, Part 2, include this text exactly as written. Text. Write only and exactly. Chapter 4, Part 2 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. Say three roterista inglés longa hora dice, Eleanor Wade's departure from the valley did not erase her presence. If anything, absence thickened her legend. Families continued to speak of her in hushed tones, as though she might step through the doorway at the sound of her name. Some claimed they saw her figure on the ridgeline during storms, shawl pressed close against the wind. Others dismissed such tales as shadows cast by grief. But in kitchens and fields her name lingered, bound to the memory of infants who never drew more than a gasp of air. The county's new ordinances were enforced with rigid formality. Midwives signed their names into the registry, ministers inspected ledgers, and families learned to demand that births be witnessed. The rules provided structure, but they also spread unease. Women confessed to Whitfield's successor that they felt less safe with strangers peering over their shoulders, tallying the intimate details of labor as if numbers could guard against sorrow. Yet the law had left no other path. The valley had chosen paper and signatures to stand where trust had failed. Dr. Hale remained in correspondence with the medical college for several years, his letters marked by exhaustion and restraint. He described the valley as a place haunted not by specters but by silence too long permitted. He urged that midwifery be regulated through training and oversight, a proposal that reached only the margins of academic debate before being set aside. His packet of notes, bundled with Markham's accounts and Alden's inventories, became a quiet archive that few students opened. Those who did often closed it quickly, unsettled by the spare precision of the evidence. For Markham, the case became both burden and obsession. His articles never appeared in his newspaper, but his notes circulated in private circles, handed from editor to editor, cited in debates over women's health and medical authority. In 1845, he published a pamphlet under a pseudonym, weaving the valley's story into an argument for standardized obstetrical training. He never named Wade outright, but readers familiar with the region recognized the contours of the account. The pamphlet drew criticism from physicians who called it sensational, yet it also found sympathetic audiences among reformers who believed secrecy was the enemy of survival. The valley itself remained divided. Some remembered Wade as a figure of cruelty, a woman who had stolen infants under the guise of care. Others, though quieter, insisted she had acted where men of law and medicine had failed to appear. They argued that her tools, however misused, had been the only barrier between mothers and death, in a time when the nearest physician could not arrive before fever or bleeding claimed a life. This tension persisted long after her cell door closed behind her in 1846. Stories began to shift with retelling. Children raised in the years after her trial grew up hearing fragments of testimony transformed into parables. In one telling, she was a woman who tested God's patience by deciding which infants deserved to breathe. In another, she was a midwife who took upon herself the suffering of mothers, bearing their choices in silence when no one else dared. Truth blurred with myth, until both became inseparable. The physical remnants of the case did not vanish. The storehouse where the bundles had been laid for counting remained closed for years, its boards weathering until only fragments of its roof clung to the rafters. The courthouse kept its ledgers locked, Brewer's uneven handwriting preserved beside the stamped pages Alden had gathered. Each mark of stillness in the margins became more than notation. It became a wound recorded in ink, reopened each time the book was read. In Philadelphia, the archive lay undisturbed until a student in the 1850s copied portions into his own notes. The copied lines surfaced decades later, in a lecture on the dangers of unregulated practice, stripped of names but carrying the unmistakable details of Wade's ledger and the hollow beneath her hearth. The case entered medical discourse not as history, but as caution, a ghost story for physicians who believed that ignorance, left unchecked, could kill as surely as poison. As the century advanced, the valley bore other sorrows: failed harvests, outbreaks of fever, the march of soldiers through its roads during the war. Yet, when mothers bent over cradles, they still told daughters to keep lamps bright during labor, to guard against the hush of silence that once fell in Wade's shadowed rooms. The warnings were not spoken in sermons or laws, but in the quiet voice of inheritance, passed down as firmly as recipes or hymns. Wade herself disappeared from public record after her release. Some said she settled in Philadelphia with kin, others that she moved west to vanish among the shifting borders of new towns. A few letters surfaced, written in her hand, offering remedies for cough and fever, addressed to women whose names bore no connection to the valley. Beyond that, silence. Her absence became part of her story, as potent as her presence had once been. Generations later, when the cabin finally collapsed into rot, boys scavenging its timbers found beneath the hearthstone a sliver of wood stamped with the faint outline of a circle. The discovery was carried to the schoolmaster, who placed it in a drawer and told no one beyond a single trusted friend. The fragment never appeared in any official record. It remained a private reminder that the soil still held traces of a truth too heavy to name aloud. Memory in the valley bent to survival. The case was rarely spoken of in daylight, yet it persisted in the cadence of warnings and the unease of night. Labor. In whispers, Wade became less a person than a shadow, invoked when mothers dimmed lamps or when infants stirred restlessly in their sleep. Her name, once written in court ledgers and testimony, slipped into the private register of fears, passed from one generation to the next. And so her story closed not with the sound of verdict or gavel, but with the lingering silence of a community that never resolved its own complicity. The law had spoken, yet the earth beneath the hearth and the pages marked with circles told another story, one not easily silenced. The valley endured, the ledgers filled, the graves marked, but the question remained, pressed into every quiet room. Where breath might falter, who decides when life should begin and when it must end? If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way we'll know how far these stories reach, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.